I'm Rick Dadarian, and you're listening to Realms of Memory.
The Topography of Terror Memorial is now one of the most important Holocaust memorial sites in Germany. It is a very large and well-funded institution, and that also has sort of an umbrella function. So it also takes care of some other sites, and it has a networking function, not just within the Federal Republic, but beyond, transnationally as well. And it really started, though, as a citizens' initiative and literally by people organizing a protest action in 1985 to literally dig up the past. So they went to this site, which was the former headquarters of the Gestapo and other ministries of the Nazi state in central Berlin, although at the time it was right by the Berlin Wall. So in West Berlin it was peripheral, but now it's in the center of Berlin. And, they took shovels, and it was a bit of a performative act, but they did, in effect, push the Berlin government to then conduct archaeological research there, and they dug up the walls of those buildings, the foundations of those buildings. So this citizen action, which is very much a grassroots left-wing initiative that was still working against sort of mainstream narrative at the time, was very much oppositional at the time. Led ultimately to this very large and important institution. And, a lot of the people who were at that day on 1985 who were digging, then later became important institutional actors. So this sort of development from civil society, grassroots action to institutional clout is very well represented in this site. So my name's Jenny Wüstenberg. I'm a professor of history and memory studies at Nottingham Trent University in the United Kingdom. And I'm also the founding co-president of the Memory Studies Association. And I work on memory activism, as will be clear in the book that we're discussing today.
Jenny Wüstenberg is the co-editor of Decommemoration, Removing Statues and Renaming Places, Agency and Transnational Memory Politics, and the Routledge Handbook of Memory Activism with Yifat Gutmann. We'll be talking with her today about her book, Civil Society and Memory in Post-War Germany. Jenny, thanks for taking time for this episode of Realms of Memory.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you mentioned at the beginning of your book that you have a family connection to this past. Was that a key motivator for taking on this work?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the one hand, I think, I'm fascinated by memory politics in general because my family history is not black and white in this department, as it probably is the case for most people. So on my mother's side, she grew up in northern Germany with a family that was very much supportive of the Nazi regime. And in fact, her mother died in childbirth, giving birth to her fifth son, believing that she needed to supply a lot of soldiers to Hitler. And my mother really grappled with this history all her life, and was part of the 1968 student movement. And of course talked to me about it as well. But it was a very personal issue for her, having this family of supporters of Nazism. And on my father's side, rather, my grandfather fled from Nazi Germany in 1933 when his own father, so my great-grandfather, was murdered on the 2nd of May 1933 when the trade unions were taken over by the Nazis, which in German is called Gleichschaltung. So my great-grandfather had been murdered, and my grandfather was tipped off, so he was able to get out. He was a social democrat, and he fled ultimately to Great Britain. But he was then deported by the British government on a ship called the Dunera, and in an internment camp in Australia. So, I have both this history of support and resistance to the Nazi regime in my family. And, I guess I was always fascinated by how families and societies deal with that. And on top of that, I grew up in a family as I mentioned, both my parents were active in the 1968 student movement, and in the 80s, I was taken to many demonstrations, and was generally part of the sort of new left social movement scene as a kid. That is very much the underpinning for the kinds of groups that I study in this book. So it felt, the people I was talking to felt quite familiar to me in a way.
So one of the things that you mentioned at the start is that there's this misconception that World War II comes to an end and the Germans really want to forget the past. And I had that misconception too. I mean, I thought that this is a country that buries itself in work to forget the past. And the German economic miracle in part is driven by this energy, and forgetting is part of it. And you mentioned that there was a lot of remembering that was going on, but it was happening in terms of particular groups. What kinds of memory work, and who was doing the remembering after the war?
Yeah, I think this misconception, it obviously doesn't come out of nowhere, right? It comes because we tend to have a particular connotation associated with memory work, right? We think of it as the kind of memory work that helps us work through the past honestly and face up to our historical sins, right? And we tend to not see so much of the memory work that goes on that is maybe not doesn't work in favor of democracy or reconciliation or facing up to the past, or is maintaining the status quo, right? So a lot of so there was a huge amount of civil society work happening as soon as the Allies in the different zones of occupation allowed, and then with the foundation of the two German states, there was an incredible amount of memorialization happening in relation to the war experience. So the biggest, most sustained effort here was the memorialization of former German territories and the experience of the Vertriebene, so the expellees, the ethnic Germans who had been either expelled or had fled from territories in Eastern Europe. And so these markers, there were thousands literally all over West Germany. In East Germany, these kinds of activities were mostly not allowed by the East German government. But in West Germany, there really were many, and they took the form of remembering the suffering that had happened as part of this forced migration, but also, remembering the places that had been lost, that were no longer German territory. And this is supported by all the civil society activity that happened in all the German states. The sort of Heimat cultivation, right? The loss of the cultures of Eastern Europe, German-centric Eastern Europe. There were little museums and so on, but also memorials, and there were twin partnerships between cities and no longer German cities, right? So there was really a lot going on, and there was a lot of remembrance of the German dead as a result of Allied bombing campaigns, and also the experience of POWs.
And these groups had real political clout as well, right?
Absolutely. I mean, they had their own political party in the early days. And, some of the most prominent leaders in the government and sort of big or important leaders in various areas of society in the early Federal Republic were themselves Vertriebene, expellees, and they had a lot of clout and they had a lot of support from the population. And this, despite the fact that expellees had a lot of problems integrating into West German society. Right, they experienced a lot of hostility from the Germans, as all newcomers, I guess, do. So there was a lot of hostility towards migrants, despite the fact that they were ethnic Germans. And so, there was really no forgetting of this past, but it was very selective, right? None of these groups wanted to commemorate why these people were expelled from Eastern Europe, right? The causes of the war were usually not mentioned as part of that commemoration. And so there was no taking of responsibility as part of that. And but I think it's important to see that these efforts were civil society work, and that there was, very, very vibrant in a way memory work going on, but it was in line with what the government was doing. So it was not oppositional to the conservative government at the time. And of course, conservative politicians very much cultivated these kinds of groups. CDU politicians would be present at the gatherings of ex-Pili organizations, basically as a matter of course.
That's interesting, because I interviewed Akiko Takanaka on the memory of the Yasukuni Shrine in Japan, and she makes the case that that catering to war victims was key to the rise of the LDP, which dominated Japanese politics for decades after the war. So you have something similar happening in Germany.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is obviously the dilemma of how do you build a democratic state without a democratic society to underpin it, right? And without democratic leaders, or very few democratic leaders, right? And bureaucrats and so forth. So it would have been quite risky probably not to cultivate this kind of sentiment in society, and risk not having support for the new democratic institutions. And I think Adenauer and his government was quite aware of this.
So Adenauer, the first chancellor, sets up institutions that are key to developing democratic values, right? But those values are not in place for a long time, right? That and this was the point that Susan Neiman made in the first interview I had, is that the Germans really felt like they were the war's the greatest victims, right? It took a long time for that to change.
Yeah, and in this context, the Holocaust and the victims of the Holocaust pretty much get lumped in with all other war victims. So you have a lot of memorials at this time saying, to the victims of war and dictatorship, without specifying who we're talking about. So you can't necessarily say that this is complete denial of what had happened, but it was not a taking of responsibility. And the only people who were demanding taking responsibility and really shining a spotlight on, there were specific victims here that we need to remember, and the fault and the responsibility lies with the German population, was initially with survivor organizations, Holocaust survivor organizations, which very early on, from 1945 onwards, put up memorials and demanded facing up to this past. But they were a small minority, and they were not heard or funded in any significant way by the German state.
Okay. And this is your point, that you can have representative memory work that's democratic in that it's representative of what the majority believes, and what was important to the majority were their experiences of having lived through bombed out cities or being expelled from where they'd lived before, or experiences of being POWs, but that those memories aren't necessarily tied to democratic values, normative forms of memory. And it takes a long time for German memory to be more in sync with democratic values. That's a decades-long process.
Yeah, so in the book throughout, I sort of try to take apart what we mean by a democratic form of remembrance. What does it mean to, or how does memory help us think about democracy? And one of the things I try to think about is, well, yes, we tend to think that Holocaust remembrance, will save us. There's a lot of discussion about this recently, that Holocaust remembrance will help us, obviously not repeat similar atrocities in the future, that it will help us heal, right? That remembering the Holocaust in and of itself will help us develop democratic values, like tolerance, like, protection for weaker members of societies, by thinking about inclusion and so forth, value for difference, right? All of these kinds of things. But the question I was sort of grappling with is what happens when, those values, they might be represented by something that we're trying to remember. But if a majority of the population aren't actually buying into these kinds of memorializations, then we have a real problem, right? And so we have to think through what the right balance is between promoting democratic values through remembrance and making sure that they're sort of bought into by the majority. And then I think there's a third factor that I talk a lot about, which is to what extent these kinds of memories become legitimated through state power, right? When the state picks up activism from below and funds it and supports it and makes it official, that of course has a huge effect. And these three things, right? Normative remembrance, so the values that we support through memory, the representational, or the representative nature of this, whether it's supported by the majority, and state power. These three factors are all mediated through memory activism and through civil society action, right? And so that's kind of the balance I'm sort of shining a spotlight on throughout the book, and it shifts in various ways.
So if you look at East Germany, civil society initiatives are there, but they're stifled early on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so early on in the Soviet zone of occupation, and then in the early German Democratic Republic, there are, of course, similar impulses to West Germany. So we have actually the same groups emerging, groups of survivors trying to commemorate the Holocaust, but also people who'd been expelled, which they're usually called Aussiedler or Übersiedler in the GDR. And but we see very early on that the GDR state is basically squashing these attempts to commemorate because they suggest an independent civil society, right? Action that is not controlled by the state, and the state is extremely repressive at this point. It's still during Stalinism, and it can't have any of that. So that's interesting because some of the groups, especially the survivor groups, are of course not really in conflict with the memory narrative that the GDR state is putting forward, right? The GDR is celebrating communist resistance in particular to the Nazi state. And some of these groups are quite left-wing, and they're actually not opposed, right, to this kind of memory. But it is it would have been a locus for independent action, which the GDR state felt like it needed to suppress. So very early on, these kinds of things get outlawed, and the GDR state puts forward this very legitimating narrative around that it's really the successor state, or because it's a state that promotes the memory of resistance to Nazism and anti-fascism, it can't really be held culpable for the crimes of the Nazis, right? It isn't a direct successor to the Nazi state. It's its opposite, and of course, the building of the Berlin Wall then becomes wrapped up in that, as a protection against the fascists that are represented by the West.
But isn't it true that East Germany is actually committing more resources to preserving sites of memory connected to the Nazi past? I mean, you mentioned there are 3 large concentration camps that get memorialized. That there are staffs or students that are being taken out to these places. There are resources that it's devoting to these places long before West Germany follows suit.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But it, of course, gets used in a very particular way, and it serves propaganda. So especially Buchenwald, has a very particular role in kind of shaping of GDR citizens, right? With the youth, the socialist youth, always being taken there and having to swear an oath of allegiance at that site. So it gets instrumentalized in that way. And of course, a huge part of the history of those sites, which is that they were also used by the Stalinist regime in the 1950s, and where thousands of people died in those places, is of course completely silenced and is not talked about until after the wall comes down. So because those sites were so egregiously instrumentalized, despite all the money that was pumped into them and the big role that this narrative played in the GDR, it really actually was quite a problem that had to be faced up to after 1989.
Okay, so if you look at West Germany again, and you start off for several decades after the war with the memory emphasis being on the experience of victimization, and then eventually you end up by the 1980s with memory being centered on the experience of being basically the perpetrator. There's an evolution. How you mentioned of how values change, organizations that help bring about this change, generational factors. There are a variety of things that are happening, going back to, well, really back to the very beginning. I guess you could argue that these victims groups are preserving these memory sites, and you have other organizations later on. Could you talk about what is this long evolution of memory work that's happening that paves the way for this change, so that memory in Germany becomes more aligned with democratic values?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, it's important to say that this is a complex process, right? And because we are, the big difference between the GDR and the FRG are that we're talking about a dictatorship versus a flawed and an evolving, but nevertheless a democracy, right? And so early on, of course, we in the Federal Republic, we have voices that are calling for remembrance of the Holocaust. First, as I said, the victims' organizations, but also various intellectuals and politicians. And there are a few sites that are memorialized by the state early on. So Bergen-Belsen, for example, and then the Memorial to German Resistance in Berlin, they do receive support from the state and some official sort of endorsement, but nothing like what we're seeing today, right? So it's, I think it's important to say that we're not talking about complete silence here. And of course, the Adenauer government did early on also acknowledge to the Israeli government, the culpability of the German state. So, it's not complete silence, but we're seeing sort of a gradual increase in voices, first individual voices, then more civic voices. For example, with the creation of Aktion Sühnezeichen, Action Reconciliation Service for Peace in the late 1950s, which is a Christian organization that works for reconciliation and atonement on the part of Germans for the Holocaust, and is a very, very important organization up to this day. So, we're seeing, even in the 1950s, cultural and political moves sort of in the right direction. And then, a lot of people tend to see 1968, the student revolution, as a turning point. And I have argued against that idea, because even though that was obviously important politically, and the students demanded, that Germans faced up to their past, it was a very sort of ideological and, in a way, abstract demand, right? Maybe it wasn't abstract for a lot of people who then started speaking to their family members about what they might have been doing during the Nazi period and who they supported. But on a political level, it didn't actually lead to much concrete memory work, right? We actually don't see a lot of initiatives for Holocaust commemoration and a sort of honest confrontation with the Holocaust in the 1960s, early 1970s. When we do start seeing that, this is what I argue is sort of where the big shift comes, and that is in the late 1970s, early 1980s, where we have a whole bunch of developments, one of which is the increased civil society mobilization that my book talks about, But others are, for example, the screening of the TV series Holocaust that was seen by a huge number of people in West Germany, and generational change, technological change, right? A shift from sort of the post-war generation, but also the shift away from being focused on mostly economic development, sort of post-industrial phase, which is, of course, a global development. And what I really focus on is a sort of post-1968 milieu in a way, where after the 1968ers had basically failed with their student revolution, some of this generation then radicalized, right, and went underground. A few, very small minority, of course, but most of those who had been involved in the student movement or who came shortly after, who began studying, for example, at the universities that just had seen this student mobilization, most of these people then organized themselves in lots of different kinds of new social movements, right? So we're talking about the women's movement, the peace movement, the environmental movement, the anti-authoritarian childcare movement. So lots of smaller groups and projects in every city, right? They were much more dispersed, not as ideological, much more focused on practical change. And one of these movements that was actually quite a bit smaller than most of the ones I just mentioned was the history workshop movement. And I don't know if you want me to go into that.
Well, I think what interested me, because, you have society that's changing, right? So people get interested in local history. So I think that's your main point. The history workshop movie, it's all about local histories, but and particularly the period of National Socialism, but this interest is part of a larger memory boom, a larger interest in that past. And you mentioned it's often triggered by certain events that encourage people to react. There's almost like a sentiment of outrage, of neglect, right? And you mentioned that often the trigger events are anniversaries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, if you imagine, what happened after 1968 is that you have a sort of the creation of this sort of social movement scene where there's just interest and passion for being involved in all kinds of different areas. And then when something happens, like a city celebrates an anniversary, or there's a media event like Richard von Weizsäcker gives a speech in front of the German Bundestag in 1985. When you have a trigger event like that, progressives on the left react by demanding more deep engagement with the past, right, rather than staying on the surface. So when a city celebrates its, 1,200-year history, and does so in a very, unreflective way, then there are people in place who will say, actually, we want to do this differently, right? And then a group forms on that basis, or a group forms in response to a shopping mall being built, and there's a plan to tear down a site that was important for the local Nazi past, like a Gestapo headquarters or something along those lines. So usually these dynamics are very localized, but cumulatively you have this happening all over the Federal Republic and in West Berlin. And so it actually becomes a movement, right? And so it's very bottom up. That means that these groups are quite different in their focuses. So yes, there's a lot of focus on the history of National Socialism, but some groups also focus on working class history, on women's history, on environmental history, right? It always depends on what's important locally. But the approach that these groups take is quite coherent in a way. And that's what allows these groups to network amongst each other and to sort of begin to see that they're not alone, right? That there's a whole movement going on here.
And you mentioned this with this history, this grassroots history workshop movement, or the history movement, they're just engaged in a huge array of a wide array of memory work. I mean, they're involved in all kinds of different. Could you provide a sense? Could you give a sense of what are they doing? What kinds of memory work are they involved with?
Yeah, interestingly, I don't think that any of the people back then, or even maybe today, would refer to this as memory work, because for them it was really historical research, but historical research that was politically informed, emancipatory in the sense that, they had they had a vested interest in making German society more democratic and facing up to the difficult episodes in German history. So not to just celebrate and gloss over the difficult bits, right? And so actually, what I thought was so fascinating is that these groups, they really start in a very ad hoc manner, very project oriented. The funding is not consistent. They sometimes get some money, for one project, or they just self fund, and they'll investigate, what was this working class housing project that was built in the 1920s? This was here. What's its history? Who lived here? Why did they build it? What happened here during the National Socialist period? And because they're doing this in-depth research, going into the archives and finding things that hadn't been known before, they then often decide, well, we need to mark this, right? So they almost always create temporary exhibitions and things like city tours, but they also often demand that something more permanent is put in place. Sometimes they demand a plaque or a memorial, or they make it themselves. And sometimes this leads to the creation of memorial sites. So then they collaborate with other initiatives that are also much more focused on the Nazi past and Nazi sites of terror. And this is interesting, right? Because they don't set out to memorialize, but actually, if you look at what was created in terms of memorial markers in the 1980s and then 1990s, and who was the initiator, it is overwhelmingly civil society organizations that are behind it. And this was something that when I started this research was not at all clear, right? You often, when you read accounts of how a particular memorial came about, the information about who was behind that drive is usually quite vague, right? It'll be in the passive tense, or you might be able to read who inaugurated a memorial, but that doesn't tell you who initiated it, right? And so that's where my research question basically came from, is, to figure out what was the role of civil society organizations in all of these different instances. And I found that it was overwhelming, right? So many of these sites would not exist today without memory activists.
How does that actually happen? Because you have these history workshops where they're doing things locally. They're trying to give tours and challenge street names or bridge names, or put together local archives, or organize festivals, or put on exhibits. How do they actually become involved in protest and efforts that really challenge the dominant memory culture? Because I think this is one of your main points, that for values to change, you really need to unsettle people.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, I mean, we have to remember that at this point, it's maybe hard because it wasn't that long ago, right? But in the early 1980s, the vast majority of sort of the public landscape of memory, if you will, was not commemorating the bad elements of German history, right? I think for the most part, it was just very vague. As I said, there was no outright denial, but there was, a lot of this sort of, well, let's remember the victims of war, without any specific mention of who the victims were. No remembrance of the perpetrator, or naming the perpetrators, the Nazi perpetrators, and the implication of the general population in the Holocaust and in the war. And also, there were still a lot of older Nazi era or imperial memorial markers around that had not been decommemorated. So the landscape itself was very different, and when these kinds of groups started becoming active, they might not have, intended to be protest movements, but because they immediately faced quite a lot of resistance from local government, regional government, and federal government actors, they immediately were in the opposition, right? And of course, this was in the context of other social movements. So a lot of the people active in the History Workshop movement were also active in the Green movement or the Peace movement, right? So there was a very strong sense that this government does not represent us. They are conservative, right? And this was the time when Kohl was talking about, being lucky to have been born late and not having to take responsibility for the Nazi past, essentially, and meeting Reagan at Bitburg. And these are the kinds of public events that the federal government is putting forward. So these groups were very much feeling like they were in the opposition, which really helped them organize and galvanize support. Right, people were quite outraged. And they experienced this over and over again at the local level, that they wanted to put up a memorial marker and were refused. And there was, resistance to acknowledging the local Nazi past. So we have this, right? And so that the past that these groups are trying to commemorate are, by definition, oppositional. And what they want to do is a very different approach, right? As I said, what we see at this time is very vague and non-specific, and also very centralized, right? The big memorials that exist to commemorate the war, right? They're large traditional memorials, like the Neue Wache, or the memorial that Kohl was planning in Bonn at the time. And what the groups wanted to do differently is to say, look, we want to say who was victimized, which different victim groups were they, and also who were the perpetrators. And we want to show, we want to show this in authentic places and not just in one central place in the city square or in Berlin or in Bonn, right? This needs to be part of everyday life, and you need to be able to encounter this history everywhere you go, essentially. So this idea of decentralizing the memorial landscape was quite important, and that it's linked to authentic elements of history and not just sort of glossing over a general narrative. So it was a very different approach, and I think the protest element comes in because of the subject matter, but also because of the immersement of this of these activists in the larger social movements, and the larger social movement scene, where protest was just kind of the go-to way to get things done.
I was aware of things like the stumbling stones and other memorial initiatives, but I don't think I really appreciated how they were part of this new memorial aesthetic that you discuss. It really seems to grow out of the history movement. How does the nature of which you memorialize the past, how does that undergo a radical change? And what are some examples of that?
Yeah, as I mentioned, it is a reaction to this very strongly felt rejection of the mainstream approach that was still around in the 1980s. And so you have not only these civil society groups, but also a lot of important artists, like Gunter Demnig, who's the person behind the Stumbling Block initiative, but also others, who start to think about how can we make memory less, less propagandistic or less sort of imposed from above, and more something that gets people to reflect and to think through their own implication in history, their own responsibility for history and for the future, right? So how could memory unsettle as well, right? As you said earlier. And what I've sort of tried to do is look at what the outcomes of these movements, in terms of their memorial aesthetic is, and how you could maybe tease out some key principles of this kind of civic Holocaust remembrance. And as I already mentioned, one key principle is that it's decentralized. So these initiatives want to mark places where history happened and not necessarily in central locations. And so you end up with a sort of network of memory, right? Which is very much represented by the Stolpersteine, by the stumbling blocks, because you just stumble over them wherever you go in any German city now. There are tens of thousands of them. And they're connected to authenticity. So obviously that's a problematic term, but the idea is to mark and to stay as close as possible to historical facts, right, and to historical places, and to kind of stay on a small scale, right, not to place really monumental memorials that kind of overwhelm the visitor, but rather to try to create memorials that evoke reflection in people. And this, I think, first of all, that's a reaction to the very monumental memorial aesthetic that the early Federal Republic pursued still, right? With these sort of, let's remember all victims of dictatorship and war in one central location. And it's to some extent also a reaction to fascist aesthetic. And it's interesting to think, I always like to cite this example when the most well-known memorial in Germany today, of course, is the Berlin Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, which is very monumental, right? It's very large. It's in a very central location, and it doesn't really connect to authentic historical events in any real way. Now, that memorial was the result of a citizens' initiative, but it was a very small initiative. It was just a few people, really, and it was very quickly picked up by prominent political leaders. And a lot of the people I have interviewed from who are part of the historical the history movement and the memorial site movement were absolutely opposed to that memorial, very much because of its monumentality and its lack of connection, and the sense that if we plop a big monument somewhere, the risk is that German society will consider their job done, right? Will think, well, you can't accuse us of not commemorating the Holocaust because look what a great big thing we've put right in our city as the center of our capital, right? And so their point was, that we can't have monuments that actually cut off debate. We need monuments that evoke debate. And the last, I think, very telling element of the memorial aesthetic of this movement is that it's very much tied to naming specific perpetrators, circumstances, and also the diversity of victims. So previously, you might have commemorated, all victims at a concentration camp site, and not named that, gay men experienced something specific versus Roma versus Jewish victims, right? That their experience and their victimization had particular elements, and that importantly, of course, this relates to current discrimination still, right? The fact that we didn't commemorate gay men and Roma for a very long time has to do with the ongoing discrimination of these groups in society up until the present, right? So that shows you how there's a link between this movement, between remembering the past and taking charge of the present and being a progressive force in the present, right? So it's a very political move in a way.
Okay, so with the collapse of East Germany, you have a whole new group of memory actors who want to memorialize their own past, and it seems like what they do is very similar to what the history workshop movement, what the history movement and the history memorial site movement did before. Yet you mentioned that there's also a clash of between this new movement and the older one. In what ways are they at odds?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, it's important to point out that these post-1989 memory activists that are trying to recall repression in East Germany, but also other elements of East German history. They're also building on the actions of earlier activists, right? So we have early on, as early as the 1950s, activists commemorating, for example, the 1953 uprising, people who had fled East Germany after that uprising, former political prisoners who had come to West Germany, right? So the very, very strong interest organizations of victims of communism that are present in West Germany and that actually get cultivated, especially by conservative parties in the Federal Republic. So in a way, these are part of the narrative of German victimhood, right, early on, because communist repression is seen as one more way that Germans experience hardship, right, together with the other topics like expulsion and bombings and so forth. So the victims of communism are very much part of conservative politics, which is why once the left-wing approach to the past, where the Holocaust is centered, becomes dominant, the remembrance of the communist past and communist repression in particular become sort of automatically suspect, right? Because they were used or they're under suspicion for possibly relativizing the Holocaust, right? So there's that tension and the sense that if you pay too much attention or if you give too much sort of public recognition to victims of communism, that this might suggest that we're no longer taking the Nazi past as seriously, right? So that there's a political issue. And of course, there is just a clash of political affiliation between the activists of the victims of communism and the victims of Nazism. And this plays out in a very concrete way at some key sites like Buchenwald, like Sachsenhausen, where they're both victim groups have a stake, right? Because those sites were used to, first of all, as concentration camps under the Nazis, but then as Stalinist camps. And so there's a direct kind of competition between those groups and very, very personalized conflict. So, a lot of this is really down to clashes between individuals and groups that make a sort of global approach to the issue much more complicated. But the way in which these groups operate, right, that they're civic, that they are focused on doing historical research and marking sites is quite similar. Though I would say that the victims of communist repression maybe have their main focus on achieving public recognition and commemoration, and less so historical research, which is flipped for the early groups of the 1980s of the historical of the history workshop movement and the memorial site movement, if that makes sense.
But they want their own experience of victimization to be prioritized.
Yeah, that's right. So by this point, so we're talking early 1990s. In a way, these groups, the victims of communist repression, have a great advantage, which is that the memorial institutions that have now emerged have sort of a standard modus operandi, which means that civil society is consulted as a matter of course, right? So where in the 1980s, the civil society actors had to demand that they would be heard and included in discussions. This is kind of how these institutions now operate. So that's a great advantage. But at the same time, there is a level of suspicion because victims of communist repression tend to be on the right. And there is sort of a standard, right, which has to do with the geopolitical position that the United Germany is in, which is that it has to prove that it's now a trustworthy partner internationally and that it will continue to address its Nazi past and that it is no longer a dangerous state, right? And so it's basically hugely underpinned with state interest that the Holocaust remains the central focus of commemoration, of official commemoration, which means that any competitor that is automatically sort of in competition, right, feels in competition. And there's sort of because there's that standard, this is the most important. Victims of communism, often voice the sense that they're second class, which of course I'm not agreeing with here, but that's the sentiment, right? That if people were taking us really seriously, we would also have a huge memorial in the Berlin city center, and then that would prove that German society is really taking our past as seriously.
But you argue that these East German memory actors, and you divide them up into different groups, right? The victims groups, you have pragmatists, so people maybe who weren't even from East Germany, but are interested in that past, of dissidents, and for-profit groups. They undertake really important memory work that might not have been done otherwise, and they really preserve sites of memory. So some fascinating examples. Wall on the Berlin Wall in particular, and I think your point that you finish with, right, is that you have a dominant memory culture. The success of the memorial history movement, memorial site movement threatens to kind of stifle this new group of memory actors who have an important contribution to make to the way, not just the memory work, but how memory reinforces democratic values.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I show with quite a few examples, a lot of the sites that are now state-funded or at least supported memorial sites that recall repression in the GDR would not exist today without civil society action. And, it was really the passion and the energy of mostly former political prisoners who can be credited with that. And I think that they do have a really important role. And as I said, this, the fact that they're often pigeonholed as sort of right wing or conservative, at least, means that we maybe miss the important role that they have, because they of course are much, well, in many cases anyway, we're talking about a more recent past, a past that is probably less well known, for example, to school kids in Germany, and so still has the ability to unsettle and get people to think through what it means to protect democratic values, or what would happen. What would you do if your democratic rights were being violated, and to what lengths would you go, right? So even though, and maybe because it's quite controversial, and these sites are complicated places, I think they have great potential for political education. And I think there's often sort of a reluctance, or there's a sense that we now know how to do this, right? We know how to run a memorial institutions. We know who to talk to, and we know how particularly to talk about the past in a very non-emotional, sort of relatively removed way. We know which words are appropriate and which aren't. And these actors from the GDR, that are focused on the GDR past, sometimes violate those rules, which are being upheld by the former activists of the 1980s, right? And that's for good reason. They're being defended because those activists had to push them through against considerable resistance against a state that was not deeply democratic at the time. So, there's this tension between the activists of the 1980s and 90s that are focused on the Nazi past, who, have good reason for thinking that they need to defend their accomplishments. And then maybe it's a little bit in their DNA as well, right, from having done it for so long. there's a tension between them and these newer actors that maybe have a different approach. They want to be more emotional. They think, well, we need to really drive home the fact how horrible this was and how what the experience was like for people, and maybe it's okay to overwhelm people sometimes with this. And so there's this sort of difference in approach, and I think they often feel like the GDR memory activists often feel like they're being sort of put into a framework that's not of their own making. So I think that's where the tension often exists to this day. I mean, there are conflicts between these different kinds of actors.
Jenny, thank you so much for taking time to speak with me today. I want to make sure I leave you with time to eat your lunch.
Well, thank you. It was a wonderful conversation. And of course, as always, clear that, if things are complicated, there's always more to talk about.
Jenny Wustenberg is Professor of History and Memory Studies in the School of Arts and Humanities at Nottingham Trent University. She is the founding co-president of the Memory Studies Association. She is the co-editor of Decommemoration, Removing Statues and Renaming Places, Agency and Transnational Memory Politics, and the Rutledge Handbook of Memory Activism with Yifat Gutmann. We've been talking with her today about her book, Civil Society and Memory in Post-War Germany. Next month, we'll turn to the first of 2 episodes on the memory of partition in India and Pakistan, some of the worst violence, and also some of the most dramatic demographic and economic changes that followed the end of British India and the creation of India and Pakistan happened in the Punjab. To look more closely at the implications of partition in the Punjab, we'll hear from historian Pippa Verde from the University of de Montfort in the UK about her book, From the Ashes of 1947, Reimagining the Punjab. If you've enjoyed this episode, please tell a friend or leave a review on your favorite podcast app. I'm your host, Rick Dadarian. Thanks again for listening to Realms of Memory.